In August 1990, Iraq invaded its neighbour Kuwait. Within 48 hours, the entire country had fallen. Saddam Hussein's army, nearly 1 million soldiers and over 5,000 tanks, had seized one of the world's most oil-rich nations in a single night. What followed was the largest military coalition assembled since World War II. 39 nations, over 670,000 troops, and more than 3,000 tanks massed in the Saudi Arabian desert, ready to take Kuwait back. For the Americans, it was their biggest military deployment since Vietnam. For the British, their largest armoured commitment since the Second World War. The ground war that finally came lasted 100 hours. It was the most lopsided armoured conflict in modern history. The Iraqi army never had a chance. But this video is not about how decisively that war was won. It is about what the victory coverage didn't show you. In those same 100 hours, the coalition that defeated Iraq lost 154 American soldiers and 9 British soldiers, not to Iraqi weapons, but to friendly fire. Nearly 1 in 4 American combat deaths, 9 British soldiers killed by American aircraft in broad daylight, with coalition identification markings clearly visible on their vehicles. The Iraqi army didn't do that. The coalition did it to itself. The Pentagon, when it confirmed these figures, described the rate as an anomaly, something unprecedented, a product of the specific conditions of that specific war. But the soldiers who were in those vehicles, who watched their own side's rounds punch through the armour next to them, had a more direct way of putting it. They used a phrase the military has always hated: blue on blue. This is the story of what actually happened in the desert, why the most technologically advanced military force on Earth turned its weapons on itself and its closest ally, and what it cost the men who were there. To understand why so many coalition soldiers died at the hands of their own side, you have to understand what made the American military so lethal in the first place. The M1A1 Abrams tank entered Desert Storm, carrying a thermal imaging system. That was, in 1991, unlike anything else on the battlefield. It could detect heat signatures through sandstorms, smoke, and total darkness. At 5 kilometres, the thermal sight on an Abrams could detect the heat trace of a man relieving himself behind a sand berm. Abrams crews reported scoring first-round kills at 3,000 metres against Iraqi crews who could not see them at all. The Iraqis were setting their guns to a default battle range of 1,800 metres, the outer limit of what their analogue systems could handle under pressure. The Americans were engaging and destroying them from distances those same Iraqi crews had no way of knowing were even possible. The depleted uranium round fired by the Abrams 120mm gun was, in the words of soldiers who used it, the silver bullet. A 4.6 kilogram penetrator that self-sharpened on impact and could go through 2 T-72s with a single shot. One documented engagement confirmed exactly that. This was not a close fight, it was a systematic destruction. The 100 hours of ground combat resulted in roughly 3,300 Iraqi vehicles destroyed. The coalition lost 31 tanks, and not one of those was destroyed by Iraqi fire. The weapon that gave American crews total dominance over the Iraqi army was the same weapon that, in the dark and the smoke and the chaos of those same 100 hours, also killed their own people. Because a thermal sight cannot tell you whose flag is on the vehicle, it can only tell you the vehicle is hot. The first friendly fire death of the ground war happened before it had officially begun. It was 10 past midnight on February 17th, 1991, a week before the main ground offensive. Lieutenant Colonel Ralph Hayles, call sign Gunfighter 6, was in the gunner's seat of an Apache attack helicopter, battling 60-mile-per-hour winds over the Iraqi desert. Hayles was 42 years old, a 17-year veteran, the commander of an elite attack helicopter battalion. His men called themselves gunfighters and snapped to attention when they saluted him. Division staff considered him a cowboy, but a competent one. 3 weeks earlier, in a press interview, he had said with complete confidence that his unit would not shoot coalition forces. US ground scouts had reported possible enemy vehicles north of the screen line. The weather was appalling. A sandstorm with near-zero visibility. Hayles had argued against flying. He was overruled. He then broke his own division commander's standing order by putting himself in the firing aircraft, rather than commanding from a distance. He hadn't slept in 30 hours. Through his cockpit thermal sight, he identified 2 vehicles, sitting north of the friendly screen line. He radioed the ground commander. He was told no friendly forces were forward of the grid line, marked as 25 east-west. He crept closer. At 3,800 metres he made his decision. He tried to fire the Apache's 30mm cannon first. It jammed after 3 rounds. He aligned the larger vehicle in his Hellfire missile's sight. On the cockpit recording, recovered afterwards, his voice is almost flat. "I hope they're enemy," he said, "because here it comes." The missile struck dead on. "I guess you could say that hit it," he said, and fired the second. Both vehicles were American, an M113 armoured personnel carrier and a Bradley fighting vehicle. Sergeant Jeffrey Middleton and Private Robert Talley were killed. 6 other soldiers were wounded. The cockpit recording captured the full sequence, including the moment just before firing when Hayles had said, "Boy, I'm going to tell you, it's hard to pull this trigger." He sat alone in the darkened cockpit for 30 minutes after landing. The next morning, he watched the gun camera footage replayed 4 times in front of his division commander. Then he said, "I made a mistake. I made a mistake." He was relieved of his command that day. Hayles was the first soldier in over 200 years of American military history to be publicly named by the military as the shooter in a friendly fire incident. What the press and the families did with that information is a separate story. What Hayles did with it for the next 3 decades is something we'll come back to. The ground war launched on February the 24th. Within hours, the coalition advance had overrun the Iraqi frontline positions. Men who had been bombed for 6 weeks, starving, demoralised, surrendering in their thousands. Marines captured nearly 10,000 prisoners on the first day alone. Ahead of the advancing coalition, the Republican Guard was waiting. On the night of February the 26th, the first major tank engagement produced the fastest, most one-sided armoured battle in recorded history. Eagle Troop, 130 soldiers, 9 Abrams, 12 Bradleys, destroyed between 30 and 50 Iraqi tanks in 23 minutes, without a single casualty. The Iraqi commander had set up a textbook defensive position facing south. The Americans had GPS. They came from the west and hit him in the flank. His entire first line was burning before he could react. Then darkness fell, and everything changed. What followed through the overnight hours of February 26th into the 27th became known to the men who were there as Fright Night. Officially, it was the Battle of Norfolk. The conditions were unlike anything the crews had trained for. Overcast skies, rain mixed with smoke from Kuwaiti oilfield fires that had been burning for days, the orange glow of hundreds of destroyed Iraqi vehicles, and in the middle of all of it, the peculiar blindness that the thermal sight created. When an Iraqi tank was cold, engine off, crew in a shelter, it showed up on thermal as nothing, the same temperature as the desert floor. Coalition vehicles had driven past enemy armour in the dark without knowing it was there. Then those Iraqi crews climbed back into their tanks, started the engines, and suddenly appeared, hot, visible, target-shaped, right in the middle of American formations. 360-degree fighting, no front line, tanks engaging in every direction. Iraqi infantry swarming coalition vehicles looking for openings. RPG teams launching from depressions in the ground. And all of it visible only through thermal sights. where every hot vehicle looked exactly like every other hot vehicle. At around 2 a.m, Bravo Company of Task Force 141 Infantry lost contact with its battalion. While trying to re-establish communications, the company drove into an Iraqi bunker complex. RPGs started hitting their Bradleys. From the thermal sights of nearby Abrams tanks, the RPG flashes and the Bradley's movements looked identical to Iraqi tanks firing. American gunners, certain they were looking at enemy armour, opened fire. One Bradley took 2 rounds, killing 3 soldiers and wounding at least 3 more. The penetrators blew off the rear door, throwing the occupants into the sand. The company commander's replacement vehicle took a round through the left side and out the right rear, killing 1 soldier. A 3rd Bradley was hit, wounding 3 more. The infantry in the back got the ramp down and set up a defensive perimeter, still believing they were under Iraqi fire. 2 hours later, at 4 a.m, a Bradley from Delta Company had driven into a bomb crater while rounding up about 20 Iraqi prisoners. Abrams tanks spotted it, identified it as enemy, and put 3 rounds into its side. The driver was killed. 2 of those rounds passed entirely through and stuck a 2nd Bradley, parked just 6 metres away, wounding its occupant. Both vehicles burned. One of them, in the words of its driver, melted to the ground. By the time Fright Night ended, 5 Abrams tanks and 5 Bradleys had been hit by depleted uranium rounds. 9 of those 10 vehicles had been struck by American 120mm sabots, a type of round that only American tanks fired. 6 Americans were dead, 30 wounded, most of them not by Iraqi fire. And those 6 deaths were not the only friendly fire deaths that day. 200 miles away, 9 of their allies had already died. That story is next. The friendly fire deaths in Desert Storm were not exclusively American. On the afternoon of February 26th, the same day that Eagle Troop was destroying 50 Iraqi tanks in 23 minutes, C Company of the 3rd Battalion Royal Regiment of Fusiliers was reorganising after fighting through a series of Iraqi positions in southern Iraq. They were part of the British Desert Rats 1st Armoured Division. Attached to them was a company of the Queen's Own Highlanders. The weather had cleared. 37 Warrior armoured vehicles were stationary, marked with the inverted V identification panels that coalition forces used to distinguish friendly vehicles from enemy ones. 2 US Air Force A-10 Thunderbolt attack aircraft, operating under the belief that they had positive identification of Iraqi armour, fired Maverick missiles into the column. 9 British soldiers were killed, 12 more were wounded. A subsequent British Board of Inquiry examined why the Warrior vehicles, visually distinct from Iraqi tanks, marked with coalition identification in clear daylight, had been fired on. The board concluded it could not establish whether the American pilots were at fault. The Americans concluded the pilots had believed they were in the right place. No one was charged. Among the dead were 3 soldiers from the Queen's Own Highlanders. Private Neil Donald was 18 years old from Forres. Private John Lang was 19 from Nairn. Private Martin Ferguson was 21 from Fort William. His twin brother Clark was also serving in Iraq. He had followed Martin because, as the family later said, he missed his twin. Martin Ferguson's last letters arrived home 2 days after he died. He had written a poem, a soldier's poem his family called it, that spoke of the horrors which haunt you each day. He had written that he anticipated the crunch was coming. He was right. He just couldn't have known which side it would come from. After the war ended, the Pentagon confirmed the friendly fire figures. 35 Americans killed by their own side, 72 Americans wounded, 3/4 of all American armoured vehicles destroyed or damaged, taken out by their own side's weapons. Add to that the 9 British soldiers killed by American A-10s on February 26th, and 12 more British soldiers wounded. A British Board of Inquiry that examined the incident for 5 months concluded it could not establish whether the American pilots were at fault. The total coalition friendly fire toll, 44 dead, dozens more wounded, all of them on the winning side, all of them killed or injured, not by the enemy they had come to defeat, but by the weapons of the alliance they were part of. The rate of American friendly fire deaths as a proportion of total combat casualties, 23%, was, according to the Army's own research, 10 times higher than any other recorded battle in the 20th century. The official explanation was a combination of factors: featureless desert terrain, fast-moving formations spread across a 300-mile front, rain, darkness, sandstorms, the ability to engage targets at extreme range, and the specific failure of thermal imaging, a system that made every hot vehicle a target, regardless of nationality. That explanation was accurate. It was also, as more than one analyst pointed out, incomplete. There was a second factor that the military was slower to acknowledge. Friendly fire was not new. The Army's own historical research showed that somewhere between 13 and 23% of American combat casualties in World War II, Vietnam and Korea had been from friendly fire, figures that had been largely suppressed or lost in the official records. The 2% figure that military spokesmen cited in press briefings after Desert Storm, presented as the historical norm, was not the historical norm. It had been invented. The Department of Defense does not routinely report friendly fire casualties separately from combat deaths in its official statistics. The Pentagon's public casualty figures do not distinguish between the two. The families of those killed are informed. The public record does not always reflect the full picture. The broader engagement at Medina Ridge destroyed or captured 547 vehicles, without the loss of a single coalition vehicle to enemy fire. But here is what needs to be said alongside that number. The only American killed in the 2nd Brigade's action was Specialist Clarence Allen Cash. He was 20 years old. He served as a scout and M3 Bradley driver with the HHC 4th Battalion, 66th Armour Regiment, 3rd Brigade, 3rd Infantry Division out of Aschaffenburg, West Germany. His vehicle was struck by a friendly tank round on the war's second-to-last day at the battle that would later be called one of the most complete armoured victories in military history. He is one of 35. His name is on the same memorials as the soldiers the Iraqi army killed. The official record does not always make the distinction. This was, in 1991, a public relations problem of considerable size. The most technologically advanced military force in history, fighting an enemy so outmatched the outcome was never in doubt, had killed nearly a quarter of its own combat dead. The question of how that happened and whether it could be prevented would define the next 30 years of American military development. Ralph Hayles came home from Desert Storm having been publicly named, stripped of his command, and identified in the press as the man who had killed 2 of his own soldiers. His career in the military was over. He also came home with a specific technical question that he couldn't stop thinking about. If a $10 million helicopter carries 16 supersonic missiles, why doesn't it carry a system that can tell the difference between a friendly and an enemy at night, in a sandstorm at 3,000 meters? Hayles spent the next 3 decades developing one. He called it Flashlight, a simple, inexpensive combat identification device that would allow any vehicle to broadcast its position as friendly to any weapon sight looking at it. He built prototypes, he refined the design, he brought it to the Army repeatedly over many years. The Army was not interested. The Pentagon's IFF, Identification Friend or Foe program, had been running since 1980. A decade later there was, in the words of a Time magazine investigation, not much to show for it. The solution the military actually deployed in Desert Storm was crude. Inverted V markings painted on vehicles, small fluorescent panels, tiny IR transponder beacons. These were the measures that 39 nations had agreed on to distinguish coalition vehicles in a 300-mile battle space in the dark. They weren't enough. Everyone knew they weren't enough. The Army's own field manuals explicitly acknowledged that the problem of identifying friend from foe At the ranges modern weapons could engage had no reliable solution. The paradox that killed those 35 Americans was this. The technology that gave the Abrams its decisive advantage, the ability to identify and engage targets far beyond the range of any previous tank, also made it impossible to verify at those same ranges whether a target was actually an enemy. You could kill at 3,500 metres. You couldn't reliably identify at 3,500 metres. And the rules of engagement that would have solved one problem, requiring crews to close to a range where identification was certain before firing, would have handed the initiative to any enemy capable of engaging first from beyond that range. Tighten the rules and your own people die to enemy fire. Leave the rules as they are and your own people die to friendly fire. The army studied this problem in detail after Desert Storm. They did not find a solution. Here is what changes your understanding of everything in this video. 12 years after Desert Storm, in the opening days of the invasion of Iraq in 2003, an A-10 struck a column of British household cavalry vehicles, the Blues and Royals, killing 1 soldier and wounding 5. The pilots had been given incorrect coordinates, the vehicles were marked, the weather was clear. The Board of Inquiry found no fault. In 2011, a NATO airstrike in Afghanistan killed 24 Pakistani soldiers at a border checkpoint. In 2015, an American AC-130 gunship destroyed a Médecins Sans Frontières hospital in Kunduz, killing 42 people. In 2016, a US-led coalition airstrike killed 62 Syrian government soldiers. None of these are the same as Desert Storm. The circumstances differ, the causes differ, but the underlying problem, the fundamental disconnect between the range at which modern weapons engage and the range at which those same weapons can reliably identify their targets, has not been solved. The Army's research after Desert Storm noted that between 13 and 23% of American combat casualties across the major conflicts of the 20th century had been caused by friendly fire. That number was not an anomaly specific to the Gulf. It was a constant, a consistent feature of modern warfare that the official record obscured. The version of Desert Storm that was broadcast on television in February 1991 showed smart bombs going down ventilation shafts, Patriot missiles intercepting Scuds, the most precise military operation in history. The other version, the cockpit tape, the voice saying, "I hope they're enemy," the Bradley melting to the ground, the letters arriving home 2 days after the soldier who wrote them, that version was confirmed by the Pentagon and then filed away. It has always been both things at once. It still is. Ralph Hayles is 75 years old. He lives in San Antonio. His Gunfighter 6 flight suit is packed away, and he keeps no military memorabilia on his walls. He is still working on combat identification technology. The military still isn't buying it. When a journalist asked him, many years after Desert Storm, how he felt about what happened in the desert that night, he stopped them before the question was finished. The question is not, how do you feel? The question is, how do you fix it? Denise Lindemann lost her son Michael in a friendly fire incident in the same war. An LAV struck by a missile. When she was eventually put in contact with the pilot responsible, she had prepared what she wanted to say. She told him that he was doing his job exactly as he had been trained to do it, the same as her son, that there was no blame. The mother of a dead soldier, absolving the man who killed him, because she understood that the system had made the mistake, not the man. Sergeant Jeffrey Middleton and Private Robert Talley. The 2 men killed by Hale's Hellfire missiles on the night of February 17th are buried in the United States. Their names appear on a list that the Pentagon does not routinely publish separately from the names of those killed by the enemy. So do the names of 33 other Americans. And 9 British soldiers, Private Neil Donald, Private John Lang, Private Martin Ferguson, and 6 of their comrades from the Royal Regiment of Fusiliers, buried in towns across Scotland and England, while the victory parades were still being planned. But the dead are only part of this story. 72 Americans came home wounded by their own side's weapons. 12 British soldiers were wounded by American aircraft. And wounded is a word that covers an enormous range, from men who recovered and returned to service, to men who carried depleted uranium fragments in their bodies for the rest of their lives, to men whose injuries the military took years to formally acknowledge and longer still to compensate. The psychological weight of surviving a friendly fire incident is a specific and documented burden. Being shot by the enemy is one thing. Discovering that the round that hit you came from the vehicle next to yours, from a soldier who was doing exactly what he had been trained to do, who made no mistake that any other soldier in those conditions wouldn't have made, is something the mind processes differently. Many of the survivors said so. The records of what they carried home are incomplete. The few that exist are not comfortable reading. 44 coalition soldiers died in that desert at the hands of their own alliance. More than 100 were wounded. Their names are on the same memorials as the soldiers killed by Iraqi fire. The official record does not always make the distinction. If you, a family member or someone you know served in Desert Storm, share their story in the comments. If this is the kind of history you want, properly researched, the full picture, not just the version that was broadcast, subscribe for new videos every week. Catch you on the next one.